Well, in the era after the end of National Socialism, the end of the Second World War, the idea that racism was bad and wrong and that people should not be organized according to um, physical traits in a way that suggested that some physical group traits suggested higher humanity and others less. This idea in general was officially discarded in East and West, right? So there are very few places after 1945 that continue to adhere to a kind of official racist policy. But those places still existed. One of them was South Africa, apartheid South Africa, of course, which even as the rest of the world moved towards an official kind of stance of anti-racism, they doubled down on racism as an organizing principle within their own society and insisted on segregation of Black and white and colored peoples in everyday life and access to institutions and the ability to participate in the democracy. Another place where this kind of official institutionalized racism persisted was in the United States. And the persistence of Jim Crow laws, de facto disenfranchisement of Black populations across much of the United States, and the de facto segregation of public spaces and access to commercial spaces for Black and white populations meant that in some ways the United States was, one of the most reactionary sites of institutionalized racism in the world after 1945. So you have this very curious situation where the world's most powerful political actor, in a way, and it's certainly its most powerful economic actor, is also the site of some of its most socially retrograde practices on questions of race and racism. So this was not overlooked by the communist countries. And in fact, from 1940s up into the 1960s, the propaganda of the communist and socialist world was, rightfully filled with outrage over the persistence of the practice of racism in the United States. And they absolutely hammered them on the exclusion of Black students from white schools, from the exclusion of Black people from the practice of voting, the practice of participation in public life. These all became, huge points of publicity for communist and socialist countries, including East Germany, of course, about the superiority of the socialist system, which practiced actual anti-racism in their way of thinking, and the United States, which spoke a language of equality and liberty, and yet continued to subjugate parts of its own population. Historians have written about this at great length, and some of them have made the convincing case that, in fact, this pressure from the socialist world is part of what helped to not only inspire things like the civil rights movement, but also to pressure the United States as a government to begin to respond to the demands of those civil rights actors, in the sense that they didn't want to be embarrassed in front of the sort of the international community through this continued barrage of propaganda from socialist countries, but also thinking again of the need to kind of woo and win favor with global South or so-called third world countries, right? If the Soviets or the East Germans could come into, a place like Ghana and point out that Jim Crow laws persist in the late 1950s, and the United States comes in, it becomes actually embarrassing for them to have to explain away the realities of their own domestic racism. So through this combination of local pressures, international pressures, of course, there was some, significant reform of the institutionalized racism of the United States. And it's really it's really within this framework of the United States comparison that you have to think about all other forms of racism and anti-racism in the 1950s and 60s. So for East Germany, or for the Soviet Union, it was very easy for them to portray themselves as morally superior vis-a-vis the United States, because the United States was in fact, doing such a terrible job on reforming internal racism in its own country. Does that mean, however, that East Germany was then somehow a genuinely anti-racist country, or was itself free of racism per se? No, it doesn't. In the early years of East Germany, there were ways in which the Jewish population in East Germany, for example, was subject to exceptional scrutiny and even persecution, because there was an idea that Jews somehow had a prior loyalty to Israel, and as Israel became more closely allied with America, then Jews in Germany, the few that remained in East Germany, were seen as sort of split loyalty, potential turncoats, and so we're actually subject to a higher level of persecution. So in that, there was a kind of a carryover of anti-Semitism, for example, in the official circles, especially vis-a-vis Jews in East Germany. The very small number of non-white people who came and spent time in East Germany as students, as trainees, and later as refugees and as guest workers, as Vietnamese people began to arrive in the 1970s, and later people from Mozambique and Cuba. These populations experienced, or report experiences of a very high degree of everyday racism from East German populations.